Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Beth Lemagloss. I'm the program coordinator and collections manager here at the Harbor Springs Area Historical Society, and we are thrilled to have so many of you with us. Our talk with Dave Lyle here in person at the museum was very, very full, but we had so many emails from people saying, "Oh, I'm not in Harbor Springs. Can you do this on Zoom?" And I relayed your requests to Mr. Lyle, and he said yes. So he's very bravely doing his first Zoom presentation, and we're thrilled to have him here tonight doing that with us. Mr. Lyle has been with the Historical Society for many years now. He started out on our board of trustees and is now termed off of the board of trustees, but is still a co-chair of our campaign, Bringing History to Life campaign cabinet, and has been a presenter of, I think, 4 or 5 other history talks for us over the years. So we are thrilled to welcome Mr. Lyle back and thrilled that he is here to share his experiences with you about his time aboard Great Lakes freighters and life on the Great Lakes. So Dave, without too much further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let you unmute yourself there. Let me see if it will let you.
Thank you, Beth.
There we go. And I will go ahead and pin you so that people can see you. There we go. And again, if anybody has any questions at any point, please put them down in the chat and I will get those asked to Mr. Lyle at the end of the program and we will cover those then. So Mr. Lyle, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you, Beth. We couldn't do this without your expertise. I'm sitting right now in Naples, Florida, and Beth has arranged this. As she said, we tried this live about a month ago, and they sold out. And so she asked if I would do a Zoom, and I said, well, sure. So here we are. We usually keep questions going throughout the talk, but please feel free to ask or raise your hand or something, and Beth will get those to us at the end, and we'll chat some more. First of all, my talk is about when I was on freighters, which was 50 years ago. Those were olden times. That was 1973 when I jumped on this boat you're looking at right there, the Champlain. I boarded her in the Sioux in it was September of 1973. So how did a kid like me end up on a freighter? I was born and raised in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Went to school at Michigan State. I was a junior, and a good friend of mine said that his dad suggested that since we didn't know what we were going to do with our lives, that we should take his sailboat for a year and figure it out. So we left on a 28-foot sloop out of South Haven, Michigan in September of 1973. 3 of us sailed that boat down the Mississippi to New Orleans, around the Keys, over to the Bahamas. We were in the Bahamas as far south as Georgetown. We were in the Bahamas for about 6 months. We then sailed up the East Coast, up to New York, up the Hudson River, through the Erie Canal to Buffalo, Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and all the way back to South Haven. It took us a year. So when you're out there for a year, you see ships and you think, gee, wouldn't that be a great job? So that's what I aspired to. I went to Duluth. I went to the Lake Carriers Association and said, hey, I want to go work on a freighter. And they said, well, what's your experience? So I told them I'd just been on a boat for a year. And so they said, well, son, we'll give you a job, but you got to shave that beard. So they took my picture and I joined the Merchant Marine. And this handsome devil right here in 1973 was in the Merchant Marine and was now going to get on a freighter. Indeed, I did shave the beard. And actually, one fine morning in Duluth at 40 below, when my mustache froze, I shaved that too. So, but at any rate, I got my ship's papers, and off I went on the on the Champlain. This is a Cleveland Cliffs boat. This class of boat no longer really exists. You'll see a few on the lakes. These boats were built in World War II. This boat was built, I think, in 1942 to get the iron ore down to Detroit so they could make tanks and guns and cannons and whatever else for the military effort in World War II. And some historians have posed the question, what ship won World War II? And I've asked this to several groups, and no one could answer what the historians, some historians said. And that ship is actually in the Straits right now. It's the Mackinac ice cutter, and the Mackinac kept those sea lanes open during the war, so all that iron ore could get to Detroit, so Detroit could make the tanks and planes and trucks and cars and all the stuff that we needed for the war effort. So there's a bit of trivia that you can ask at your next cocktail party. And if you've been up to the Mackinac and toured it, you'll even have more to talk about. So there you go. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the Champlain. This was my office. There's about 20 hatches here. Each hatch has about 30 clamps that have to be undone to undo the hatch. And then the ore goes in the hatch and out of the hatch. At the far end, you'll see this. It's like a little. It's on a track. It's a hoist, and you put it over the hatch, pull the hatch up, set it down, and then go to the next one. So another thing I wanted to point out, you see where the arrow is, that's where those little clamps are. And we each had like a 2-foot long piece of iron that we'd slip on those things to really torque them down, because it's very important when you're running that you don't get water down that hatch. The other thing you'll notice, and this is looking aft, you can see the rail over here. That's called the fence rail on a boat. And the boats I was on, of course, they all had fence rails for safety, but also in heavy weather, when you couldn't go on the deck, there is actually a tunnel on the underside going from one end to the other. And the port side was used by the crew, and the starboard side was always used by the captain. So you wouldn't want to be caught in the starboard side. If he was going to breakfast or something, you didn't want to be down there, because that was the captain's way, not yours. So it's kind of a funny thing on the ships. And again, this was olden times. Here's the Champlain. My bunk was right about in here. You'll see a porthole down here, and that's where I slept. We had a nice bunk room and a nice head that we could use. I bunked with one other crew member. We were deckhands at the time, and the captain lived and the mates lived on this deck, and we ate aft. The stewards back there. This was the wheelhouse here. You can see the old wheel right here. I never saw the wheelsman ever use that. They used the modern gyro wheel right here. But here's the old binnacle. And then back here is the chart room where all the charts would be laid out. And once in a while I get to go up there when I was off and just watch how the captain worked, and it was interesting. He had a chair and sat there supervising everything. On the Champlain, his name was Johnny Johnson. He was quite a character, but he'd been sailing on the lakes for 30-some years, and he knew him very well. This is where this picture is actually taken before the Champlain was broken up. They towed her to Turkey and scrapped her. So this is where I would eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner right here at this table. We are facing aft right now, and where I'm sitting is approximately where the little bar was where you'd order your food, and a steward would bring it out to you. And we had excellent food. We had an excellent cook. There were boats that were notorious for not having a good cook. and they were called belly robbers. So you didn't want to be on a belly robber, because if they were robbing from your belly, you didn't get good food. And my first stint on the Champlain, I was on that boat for 4 months straight. I got off once in a while in port. We were in port maybe 8 hours when we'd go in and unload and load. The captains wanted to keep these boats moving because that's how they were efficient, and that's how they got most ore down to the steel plants. So there's our dining. This is another ship I was on. This is a U.S. steel boat. This is the Enders M. Voorhees. Just as an aside, it was a U.S. steel boat that was following the Fitzgerald when the Fitzgerald went down those many years ago during that November gale. You'll also see these boats are, I've got the beam on here. The Voorhees was 67, the Champlain was 65. The newer boats that they're making, the 1,000-footers, their beams are like 105 feet. So really the ships were actually made sort of to fit the maximum amount in the lock. So it wasn't like they designed the ship and then they designed the lock. They designed the lock first. So that's why we had a lot of long and narrow boats. And again, the Voorhees was also sold for scrap in '87. She didn't want to go all the way, though. She cut loose of her tow off the Spanish coast and ended up on an island, crashed. So she didn't get to go for scrap. So that was good. Now, this is where we used to work. This is the Great Lakes. And typically, we would start either in this Minnesota coast here. There's a place called Two Harbors or Silver Bay. We get taconite or ore up here, or in Duluth. And we'd bring the ore around Copper Harbor, down through Sault Ste. Marie and the St. Mary's River. And then typically we'd go down Lake Huron and go through Lake St. Clair, and once in a while we'd leave the ore at like McClough Steel in Detroit, but most of the times we would either take it to Cleveland or Ashtabula, or there's a place called Conneaut down here. These are all places that had refineries for that ore, and most of the time it was, and even today I think it's all taconite. There's very little raw ore that comes out of there. They've learned to turn the ore into these little pellets. They're like big marbles. So they're easily loaded onto a ship and unloaded. And I think a boat like the Fitzgerald would take 58,000 tons in one trip. And that's a lot of cars, you know, in the end result. The one thing about our trips, once in a while, we wouldn't just be hauling ore. One time, we were down in Cleveland unloading. We cleaned our hold, and we went over to Gary, Indiana, and we loaded up with corn. And this was very unusual for us, but we listened to the news. And we heard that Gerald Ford in 1973 had said to the Russians, you guys are violating human rights, so we're not going to sell you any corn this year. So he was spanking them in his own way. So what we did was we took this corn, we started down in Gary, up in Lake Huron, down in Lake Erie. We went up into Lake Ontario now, and then we got in through the Welland Canal. We went up into Montreal, and next slide. Here's Montreal here, and here's Montreal on this sheet down here, Montreal. Another 500-600 miles into salt water now. We went up to a place called Port Cartier. And it was very unusual to stand on the decks of an ore freighter and look down and see a dolphin in salt water. That was very, very unusual. So at any rate, we were coming into Port Cartier. Here we are in lovely Canada. Apparently the Canadians didn't have any trouble selling corn to the Russians, because the Russian ship was sitting right there at their docks. And on the other side of the dock was an Israeli ship at the time. And there were armed guards at both gangways. So I didn't think they were getting along. It was a little tense on the dock there. But we unloaded our corn, and we didn't have any trouble. Although I did go up to the local bar with one of our crew members, and we were in Quebec, and so he was a little worried about the language. So I said to him, well, don't worry, because, I have some high school French. I'll take care of this, So we went into a bar and ordered a beer, and I said, deux le bats, s'il vous plaît. And the waitress looked at me and said, la bats. It's not le bats. So my crew member wasn't so confident of my linguistic ability after that. But nonetheless, we did get a couple of beers and had a little time off the boat, and got back on board. And that night, when we were leaving, I saw the most spectacular, and I mean spectacular, Mother Nature show that I'd ever seen. The northern lights were out, and they were curling like a Christmas candy cane on the horizon and up above us. And they were swirling with greens and reds and yellows, and it was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen in my life. So I'll never forget Port Cartier because of that sight. And I know this summer we had a lot of sightings in northern Michigan too, of the northern lights, and they were beautiful, and they are beautiful, and they're never the same. So the heavens were smiling on us that night. It was a beautiful show. And as my jaw hits the deck and I'm looking at this fantastic light show, the second mate comes up and says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, mate, look at this. Look at what Mother Nature's put up here for us." And he said, "Get back to work. We gotta pick this boat up so I can get back in my bunk." So he wasn't very interested in the light show, but so we put the boat back together, and I snuck back out and watched the light show because it was beautiful. So that was Port Cartier. This is another boat I was on. This is the American Legacy, and she was a container ship. I caught this boat in New York Harbor, and we went down the East Coast. It was called the Northern European Run. We went from New York, we went down to Savannah. We unloaded and loaded some containers. We went down to Jacksonville, loaded, unloaded some containers. Then we went over to Rotterdam in Holland, which is a beautiful place. The tugboats there, of course, the Dutch, they love their flowers. They love their tulips. The tugboats there had flower boxes. It was amazing. They were beautiful. They were like yachts. So that was a nice city to be in. Then we went to Germany, to Bremerhaven. We went to Greenock in Scotland, and then we went over to Le Havre in France, and then we went back to New York, and that was the run. That was a single run. I did that during December, and that trip back, and I think it's about 6 or 7 days to cross, I think. 3,000 miles approximately, and the boat's going 20, 25, something like that knots. But we ran into a big wind storm, and it was a beautiful sunny day. But when you go back from, you're going from Greenock to New York, you take a northern route because it's less miles, and that's the way the geometry works. So to go north, the weather got colder, the wind got stronger, and the captain put the bow into the seas, which were tremendous. These seas were, when I was trying to sleep, they were throwing me out of my bunk. I had to take all the life jackets and stick them under my mattress and kind of wedged myself against the bulkhead so I could sleep and not end up on the floor. That's how bad it was. But at any rate, so that day I went out, and if you look at this boat, these containers are piled about 5 high here on the deck right here. And there's about 30 feet of freeboard. So let's just say roughly a container is 9.6. So maybe there's 70, 75 feet to get up here. And that's where this boat deck is here. So it was rough. So we weren't working that day, but I did go ask permission to go into the wheelhouse and just see what was going on. I went up there. There's a little stairway going up here. And it was real quiet, and we're just going of like 10 knots or something. We're heading into it. You couldn't go any faster in that sea. It was so bad. And I'll tell you how bad it was. I went behind the wheelhouse rack here on the boat deck, and when I was in the trough of those waves, I could look up and see white water. I could see the waves cresting. So here I am. I'm 80 feet at least off from the bottom of the boat, and I'm looking up at the waves. So that is an astounding sight for my my second Atlantic crossing. But the boat was handling it. We were just going slow, and I think that one day, I don't know, I think we made 10 miles, because for every mile we made, we went back 9/10 of a mile. I don't know. It was quite something. So that was my trip on the Legacy. Now we're back to the lakes, and this is how we used to get ore at the Marquette ore docks. And it seemed like every place we went had a little different way of loading or unloading the boat. Today it's a lot more professional. I think they just use conveyor belts, and these boats are self-unloaders, so we don't have a lot of this equipment. But if you look up here, these are all chutes. And this chute, there's up on top of this dock, there's a railroad track. And the railroad cars would have a hatch at the bottom. They'd open up the hatch, and the chute would be lowered into the boat, and then the ore would come down in the boat. Now, talk about a slow way to load a boat. But indeed, that's how they did it. And at this Marquette ore dock, this particular dock has been abandoned. They don't use this ore dock. However, there are still 1,000-footers running into Marquette at the newer dock, which is about a mile away from this dock. Now, here you're looking at the J.W. Westcott. This is the only boat in the United States, maybe in the world, that has a zip code. It's the mail boat. And that is in 1973, we would lower a bucket down to the Westcott. They'd put our mail in there, and we'd haul it back up while we're running down the Detroit River. And you can see in the background up here, I think you can see the Ambassador Bridge right up in here. There it is right there. And ladies and gentlemen, that boat right there was the internet in 1973. I told you that I was shipping in the olden times, and there was no internet. There were no cell phones. We were lucky if we could find a phone booth whenever we would dock to unload ore or load. So really, it was snail mail. That's how you communicated with people. That's how you sent letters to your family and friends. And the Westcott is how we did it. There weren't any, I didn't see any post office boxes in those ports we would go into, because we would be way out in the industrial areas. So the Westcott was it. And as I said, I'm going to show you here. The notebooks back then were like this. They were spiral notebooks. And back then in 1973, Apple was still a fruit. It was not a device. It was not a company. So there was no GPS, for example. The freighters relied basically on radar and dead reckoning. It was the early years of Loran. Actually, the Champlain didn't have Loran either. They were just using dead reckoning in their radars. So thank goodness about the Westcott. Although it did get me in trouble. I was lowering the bucket down to the Westcott, and I noticed there was a camera crew on board the vessel. I didn't pay much attention, so we just kind of waved to them. And so I lowered the mail down, and we said yippee-ki-yay, and they gave us our mail, and off they went. Well, after I got off the Champlain, I went home, and my mother, who was somewhat prudish, said, "What did you have on your head?" I said, "Mom, what are you talking about?" She said, "I saw you on that ship. What did you have on your head?" And I was wearing like a bandana as like a sweatband around my head. And I said, "Well, I was wearing a sweatband, I guess." Mom, how did you know that? "Well, I saw you on Charles Kuralt. It was on the road." So I said, "Okay." So it's a small world after all, I guess. But thank goodness for the Westcott. Sailors today still get their mail, and sometimes you'll get a new crewman or something off the Westcott. It's still operating. It's still the only nautical zip code in America. And thank you to the Westcott. One thing about the ships, and this is I'm going to get into the newer boats now that were coming out. This is the Stuart J. Court. Her maiden voyage was in spring of '72. And this was sort of a 1,000-footer on the lakes at the time was like a miracle. And so we just loved it when we could see the court. Typically, if you're leaving Cleveland and you're going up to Silver Bay to get taconite and you come back to Cleveland, it's about a week turnaround. So you're going to see boats in the locks and in the rivers and even at sea. So we did get a chance to see the court, and everybody was really excited about the court. But what was happening, and I found it hard to get a job in 1973, but what was actually happening was, see, a boat like the court can hold maybe 2 to 3 to 4 times the ore of the Champlain, but it can move that much ore with the same number of crew. Excuse me. So what was happening was in the 50s, there were maybe 300 US flagged freighters in the Great Lakes. And when I was in the 70s, there were, 100 or so US flagged freighters in the Great Lakes. And today, I think there's 13,000 footers, and there's probably less than 50 US flagged vessels in the freighters like this, bulk freighters in the Great Lakes. So, from 300 to 50, if you need, with 300, you need, 40 men per ship. You can see as you go down, you need fewer and fewer sailors. So even in '73, I was finding it harder and harder to keep employed on the ships. I was in the Merchant Marine for 4 years, and it wasn't steady work. It was good work. It was well-paying work, and I liked to travel, but it was hard to get aboard these ships, and it's harder today. If any of you have heard of an author, John McPhee, he wrote a great book called Looking for a Ship. And it's a great story. This guy was a deck officer, and he was trying to seek steady work, and it was just very difficult. So here's another picture of the court. You can see a 1,000-footer, and the first 1,000-footer, as you can see, had the pilot house forward and the engineering machinery aft. Well, that has come and gone. The newer ships have changed. But first, let's finish the court story. This boat was called Stubby, and it was made in Louisiana. And see the pilot house? Does it look familiar? See that pilot house and this pilot house? They're the same. This front end was welded to this back end, and it went all the way around the East Coast and into the lakes. Because if you think about it, 1,000-footer in the lakes cannot leave the lakes. The Welland Canal, the way to get into salt water is those locks are only 800 feet. So the boats that are made, the 1,000-footers have to be made in the lakes. Well, this is the first one. So they built the bow and the stern section in Louisiana. They came all the way up the lakes. Then they unwelded it, took it apart, put in 800 feet of deck in the middle, welded it back together, and lo and behold, we have the Stuart J. Court. There it is. But this had to be a pretty funny looking thing going through all the way from Louisiana all the way into the Great Lakes. That was Stubby. Now, this is typical of a boat today on the Great Lakes. It's a self-unloader. This is a 1,004-footer, 105-foot beam. And we've heard of the news lately, the Great Lakes up at the locks, they're putting in another lock. And the reason they're doing that is because they only had one lock for these vessels, but they had boats going upbound and boats coming downbound. So, for example, the Barker here, she might have to wait for hours to get downbound if there's somebody else using the lock. So they're putting in another lock so you can have the 1,000-footers, one in and going up and one going down at the same time. And I put this picture of the Barker in to give you an idea of the Great Lakes. The Barker one morning, when I came down to Walster Marine, and I worked for Walster Marine for 35 years after 4 years in the Merchant Marine, 4 years with the U.S. Customs, and then 35 years with Walster Marine. Well, I came down to my office, looked out the window, and there was the Barker anchored off our dock. And they weren't coming in for fuel, but it was a heck of a storm on the lake. So they came in and were seeking shelter. So here's a 1,000-footer getting off the lakes because it's rough. And I heard also they might have needed a part or a crew member or something. I don't know, but they stayed in our harbor 24 hours and they were gone. So that's the story of the Barker. This is kind of a neat picture. This is one of the other few big Lakers with the wheelhouse forward. That's the Blau. She's 858 feet. And here's the Spear, which is over 1,000. So that 800-footer looks like a pretty big boat. And it's a heck of a lot bigger than the Champlain I was on. This is a 105-foot beam. I think the Champlain was 65-foot beam. So you could probably put about 4 Champlains on her deck. And then you go to the big time. Here's these 1,000-footers. And as I said, there's 13 of these on the lakes right now. This is, they call her the queen of the lakes, although I might call her the king of the lakes, but I guess ships are female. This is the Paul Tregurtha. And it's 1,013 feet or something like that. Is that what it says? She was launched in 1981, but this is the biggest ship now in the Great Lakes. The Paul Tregurtha. I picked this picture. This is an inland steel boat. This is the Ryerson. I thought this was just a pretty boat. The paint scheme, it was built in the 50s. It was not a World War II boat, and they wanted to make that, I think, the flagship of the inland steel fleet. And it's got a nice paint scheme, nice lines, and I think it was built in Wisconsin. I think it was built over in Sturgeon Bay, over in that area. This is a picture. I guess let's see, I'm not proud to say, but I can say that I have seen this green water and the decks awash. And if you're in the pilot house, when you're looking down on your deck and you see this, that is not fun. You keep wondering if the ship's going to come up on top of this or not, you know. That is green water, ladies and gentlemen, and it can get that rough on the Great Lakes. Here we are with the gales in November. They do come early, as Gordon Lightfoot told us. So that brings us to the Fitzgerald. On November 10th, 1975, she went down. I myself, I'd gotten off the Enders Voorhees in October of 75, and the Lake Carriers Association in Duluth, they gave me a call and they said, "Hey, we got a job for you." I said, "Great." You know, they said, "You want to go back out?" I said, "Sure." I said, "What position do you have?" He said, "Well, we've got a wiper position." Well, the wiper position is in the engine room, and that was not my cup of tea. You'll notice that the older boats, they all start with an SS. The SS on that starts that way because it's a steamship. Though there were these huge steam engines, and they were, if you went down there and saw these things, it was pretty amazing. But I really didn't want to be in the engine room. I had to be out on the deck. So I said, "No, I don't think I want that job, but thanks for calling." He said, "Well, if you don't take the job, I may not call you again." I said, "Well," I said, "so be it, but I have to be on the deck. I'll be a deckhand, but I don't want to be a wiper." So he hung up. Well, that was in October. And of course, within a month, the Fitzgerald had gone down. And I always wondered, because he wanted me to pick up a ship in Duluth, that's where the Fitzgerald was running that time of year. She was picking up ore in Duluth. So I thought, I wonder what ship he was calling for. So I may have used up one of my, if everybody gets 9 lives, I think I may have used up one for that particular phone call. So it doesn't hurt sometimes to say no. There you go. One thing I wanted to share with you folks, here's another picture of the Fitzgerald. A good friend of our family had been a VIP on a boat called the Anderson. The Arthur Anderson was a U.S. steel boat, and even today they do, on the Great Lakes, on the freighters, they allow VIPs to take trips from, say, Duluth to Detroit or something, and so they can go along and as passengers and just see how the lakes are. Well, Jim Duncan was a VIP, and he and his wife Colleen went on the Anderson and became good friends with the captain of the Anderson, Bernie Cooper. Bernie on the Anderson, this is a newer picture of the Anderson. At the time she was behind the Fitzgerald, she was a U.S. steel boat, and she was not a self-unloader. But the Arthur Anderson is still running on the lakes today, which is kind of unusual because she's an old timer. You know, she was built back in the around the World War II times, I believe. So there you go. But at any rate, the Anderson was closest to the Fitzgerald on November 10th when she went down. And when the Anderson got into the Sioux that fateful morning, with the Fitzgerald coming up missing, the Coast Guard had them tie up at the dock and quarantine. And when they did that, Bernie wrote a letter to Jim Duncan, and Jim sent it to me. I was just kind of show you the routes that were taken that day. Typically, a boat is going to leave the Sioux, go up around Copper Harbor right here, and then end up down in, you know, Duluth or Silver Bay, or 2 harbors in here to get the ore, and then come back the same way around Copper Harbor back to the Sioux. This is Whitefish Bay right here. The Shipwreck Museum is right up in here, I believe. And on one of our trips on the Champlain, it was blowing really hard from the northeast. The wind is coming out of the northeast. This is true north up here. So when we came out of the locks from the Champlain, I remember I told you Johnny Johnson, the old crafty nautical captain, he looked at all the boats that were anchored in Whitefish Bay here, and he kept right on going. And, you know, the northeast wind is blowing, so there's a huge sea out here, right? That's built up and blowing. I mean, it would have been awful down here where people were going, and it would have been bad for the ships. So they were just anchored up. They weren't going out. So what the old time captains would do is they take their boat and they would go up along the shore here in the lee of this Canadian shore where there was no waves. I shouldn't say no waves, but there weren't 30 footers like there are going to be out in here. So he just went around here and came up along the coast, and within 24 hours, the wind up here, the northeast wind had blown itself out. So now he's starting, say, up in here to go to Duluth, where all these guys are still anchored down here. So he didn't go full bore, but he just took his time and he got ahead of everybody. And then lo and behold, he's halfway there where all the guys are going to catch up with him. They're still in Whitefish Bay. So this is a trick that the old timers knew. The captain of the Fitzgerald on November 9th, he came out of Duluth, and he knew there were storm clouds coming and there were gales coming. It was to be his last trip that year, and he was going to retire. Apparently he'd been sailing for 40 years, and this is his last hurrah. So he said, okay, I know how to get around this. So he took the northern route here. He didn't go to Copper Harbor. He went along Isle Royal up here, and they ended up going over to Michipoten to stay out of that. Actually, it started as a light northeaster, then it went to northwest. So it went to northwest, it was kind of behind him. Well, of course, when he made the turn from Michipoten, you got to go down here. This is Caribou Island, and then come down this way. There's a little area called 6 Fathom Shoal between Michipoten and Caribou Island. And they think that's where the Fitzgerald may have hit ground. That's what the captain of the Anderson thinks. And there's more to the story than that. This is a copy of the letter on U.S. Steel Corporation letterhead that Jim Duncan got from Captain Bernie Cooper. This is Captain Cooper on the left. And Jim sent me a copy after he got it, and the old copies don't hold very well, so it's rather hard to read. My wife got her art pencil out and tried to make the letters bigger. But if I may, I was going to read you part of that letter this is from Captain Bernie Cooper to Jim Duncan. And I'm not going to read all of the letter. I'm just going to read the part about the Fitzgerald. The first mate did call the Fitzgerald at 1950 to give him a position, as both his radar were malfunctioning at this time. So the Fitzgerald's radar aren't working, okay? The captain told my mate they were holding their own in the pumping problem. Almost believe he swung around and then headed for the bottom. Evidently, he was so quick they did not give a mayday or shoot off a flare. Just assumed from the amount of green water going across our decks that he was having the identical sea conditions. You got to remember the Anderson was 5 to 10 miles behind the Fitzgerald. The Fitzgerald had actually slowed down so the Anderson could close with them. And at one point, the Fitzgerald asked the Anderson for a bearing because he said, you know, our radars are out. Can you help us out? So I'll keep going. Out there at times, our decks were covered with 6 feet of green water. Seas were up to 30 feet. Largest are generally from 18 to 25 feet. Just figure she took green water and never recovered. Just went down, in my opinion. I'm also sure she broke in two. As an example of the size of the sea, if you remember how high our lifeboats are out of the water, our starboard lifeboat was badly damaged by sea that came aboard aft, so this one had to be at least 30 feet. I was absolutely bugged by all the TV stations and newspapermen, the three major networks, just wouldn't give them interviews. Not because I had anything to hide, but because of what I knew was going to happen in the future. Think I was correct in this because the litigation is already starting. I'm sure I'll be a witness, so I didn't want some reporter lousing up what I would say at some future date. So that is what transpired. Lots of phone calls. Going back into the storm was a tough decision, not on my own part, but I had my ship and my people to take care of. I could possibly have lost this one. If that would have happened, it really would have been a mess. Just typical hard decisions have to be made, no matter your profession happens to be. He ended up, he said, here's what he said, had a couple of loudmouth youngsters. He's talking about the younger kids on his ship. They'd been saying rough weather was fun. Needless to say, they both changed their minds quickly when we started our search and rescue operation. Anyone who likes rough water is a damn fool. The rescue operation was, Cooper had been calling the Fitzgerald. The Fitzgerald wasn't answering, so Cooper called the Sioux and was coming down Whitefish Bay and requesting that they go out and search. And the Sioux said, "We don't have anybody to go search. Can you go search?" So Cooper had to turn his boat around. And I can remember on the pilot house of the Champlain, when we were headed down in some heavy seas, and we were headed to Whitefish Bay. It was a following sea. They were probably 25 footers, blowing hard. And the captain didn't say much, but he did say, well, it's too late now. And when you hear the captain say that, you kind of perk up. And the mate said, "Well, what do you mean, Cap?" He said, "Well, it's too heavy now. We can't turn around. We're committed. We're going. We can't turn back. We can't turn this ship around in these seas." Got to remember, the ore boats, again, are long and narrow, and they get in the trench of those seas, and they'll wallow, they'll roll. And when they're loaded, I guess the captains are worried about them rolling right over. So that's what Bernie said. So this is another part of the letter. Let's see if there's another. Well, here's another little part. Truth and conjecture are mixed in the aftermath. Briefly, here's what transpired. The Fitz called me at 15:30 on the 10th. He informed me he had lost his fence rail and two vents. The fence rail, now, that's important. They are the objects on the deck with the caps which we open and close so we can pump in and out water. He mentioned they had a list to starboard and had both pumps on the tanks. The Fitz was at this time 17 miles ahead of us. He also asked if I would stay close to him, that he would reduce speed so we could catch up to him. He said the nearest we ever were was 9 miles. At this time we lost the target and then sea clouder. So that is just a summary of what was in the letter from Bernie Cooper. And I'm going to have Beth help me here in this beautiful bit of technology that we have. And she's going to play Bernie Cooper. Now, he's passed away now, but he was talking with Captain McSorley of the Fitzgerald when they were coming down the lake. So, Beth, are you there?
I am, yes.
So I'm going to stop sharing. Is that what I'm going to do?
And actually, I can do it for you. So I just did it
Okay.
for you, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen instead. And you should all now be seeing that. Dave, can you see it okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and run this now.
I don't care what anybody says. At 3:10 in the afternoon, she had either bottomed out or had a stress fracture of the hull. That's the only two possibilities I have. She was thinking from that time on. But my theory is that the water just finally built up on her, finally up in her bow, and she had so much on it just started her down. And once she started down, the screw just drove her to the bottom. With all that extra water on deck, at times, I had as much as 12 feet on my deck at times. And I know my hatch screen was completely buried. And she was hurt. She had a starboard lip. Her fence rails were down. Got a couple tanks, vent tanks, maybe. I think that water probably pushed her down another 2 or 3 feet. Besides, the lift would increase their drift on the starboard side. My opinion is she bottomed out. The one thing is that the fence rails don't break with a ship sagging. They break with a ship hogging. And of course, my other theory is that he just dove under the water and he didn't even realize he was going down. But those 2 seas were the biggest that we ever had going down there. And they happened about 6:30 in the evening. And I just wonder if those 2 seas didn't catch up to the Fitzgerald. I just got to thinking about it afterwards, that those seas were that big. They rolled up his deck, and he's got a list. And the water stays up in the forward cabin, it's gonna put his bow down under the water. And he said, I've got a little problem. He said, my fence rail is down. I've got 2 vents missing, and I've taken a starboard list. Now, an immediate list again tells me that he either had a stress fracture or he bottomed out. He said he had his pumps on. I asked him if he had his pumps on. He said yes. And then Morgan was after that, how you doing? He said, we're holding our own. That was at 7:10. That was the last transmission we had. And he had showed no signs of panic. I mean, he was calm. So I firmly believe, I think that he thought that ship was going to get him through. Captain Conrad, he asked me if I'd personally go back out, and I was reluctant to go, really I was. But he said there's a ship on the bottom, and I felt like saying there could be 2 if I go back, but I finally decided I'd go out. We started running through a lot of debris, gas tanks, like from the stoves, life preservers, oars, canisters, but no sign of anybody else. I think it was sudden and catastrophic. I mean, the ship just disappeared completely. All he had was pick up the phone and say, Mayday, Mayday. There's nothing, I think they were going under, and they thought it was a big wave. And I think they just kept going and just plunged. I think they're probably remembered a lot more than what you realize by the ships that are still sailing. The skippers that go up through there. I still think, the thought would cross your mind when you were going over possibly where the Fitzgerald sunk and say, oh boy, there's a Fitzgerald down there. And it keeps popping up all the time. It's just there in the background waiting to be something to be said about it.
All right, so I just stopped my share. And Dave, if you want to start yours up again to finish up here. I know they just had a memorial for the Fitzgerald. Obviously, the sinking was the anniversary was 6 days ago or so. And they always have a ceremony up at Whitefish Point at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum where they have the actual bell of the Fitzgerald. And they had that memorial service just recently.
Yeah, there's the video, which there's a lot to see on their website if you're interested in that fateful night. Here's the bell. I did bring that up. That is at the museum in Whitefish Point, and at the Seamen's Chapel down in Detroit. Every November 10th, they ring the bell down there, or a bell down there, for the crew, and have a nice ceremony. And I've talked to some folks that have been to that ceremony. It's a lovely ceremony too. So, but it's a moving thing, and it hit us all pretty hard. And Gordon Lightfoot kind of nailed it in his song, From the Chippewa on Down. I'd like to thank you all for supporting the Historical Society by being here tonight. And I was going to read you a poem I wrote about this event. And we'll call it a night, Beth. We'll answer some questions though after this. Calmly they sit, awaiting the storm. It surely is brewing, they have been forewarned. The sky's a bit darker, the wind's getting fresh. The sea it is churning, the bloody mate, he smelled death. All of the signs they point to the rage. Poseidon is rustling, he's been long at rest. For storms are emotion, nature's energy. They don't have a face, but their countenance I see. As all the electric that's inside of me must come to the surface, explode and breathe free, just so with the deluge that's far out at sea. Sailors on the foredeck, Zephyr's with them too. The captain shouts his courage. I know my course is true. Come, squall, release him. Death's reward, eternity. Death's reward, eternity. Okay, that's it.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was lovely. It's, you know, I heard you speak in person, and just hearing it again, it's just eerie how close, you know, you potentially came to being on the Fitzgerald. You were working exactly at that time. You had a job offer right then. And I picture your face on your Merchant Marines ID from the very beginning, you know, just a young guy on a ship like that. And it's pretty sad. So we do have time for questions if anybody has any. I didn't see any pop up in chat during the lecture, but if you have any now, please feel free to put them in the chat. Let's see, we have just a note. Dave, thanks for your very interesting program. As a kid, I spent time at my grandparents', which I assume is probably up near that same area. I'll give people a minute here to type if they've got anything that they'd like to say. But did you have anything you wanted to close with, Dave?
No, I just really want to thank again everyone for coming in. I wish I would have seen you in person, but this is still a good way to communicate. And thank you, Beth, and the Historical Society for putting it together. Happy to share a story here and there. Again, these were olden times. This was 50 years ago when all this stuff was happening. A lot of things have changed.
Yeah.
But this lake is still out there, and it still can get very fierce.
Right.
It can also be the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. So that's why we love it.
We do have, Rick finished his statement. His grandparents had a cottage on the St. Clair River, and he always enjoyed watching the freighters. And it looks like we have a quick question from Mirinda. She says, from what year to what year were you on board the freighters? Incidentally, I was also a sailor growing up in the shipping lanes.
Well, I was on, let's see, boats 73, 74, 75, and 76. And I was on Gulf Shore or offshore Gulf Mexico supply boats. I was in tugs in Boston Harbor, tankers in Boston Harbor, a ferry boat up in Copper Harbor. You know, as I said, 4 years in the Merchant Marine, and plus that 1 year on the Cameo, the sailboat that went from South Haven to Georgetown, Bahamas, and back. You know, so I got barnacles on my ankles after 35 years at Walster Marine too. So boats and water.
Yeah. Just a couple more thank yous, Dave. One from Lynn, who says such an interesting story of your experiences. And Mirinda says, I can't thank you enough for sharing this wonderful production. So I will also just say thank you so much for agreeing to repeat this talk on Zoom. It is, you know, always a little bit different than an in-person talk. You can't see people, but it's a great way for people who aren't in the area to get a chance to hear these really great stories. So we really appreciate you joining us, and we appreciate all the participants who joined us tonight. Again, there will be a recording of this presentation coming out to your email Usually I get to them within a few days after the Zoom lecture, so be on the lookout for that. Please sign up for our other upcoming programs and let us know if you have any other thoughts or questions about our History Talk series. We're always looking for new ideas and new topics to share with you. So thank you again, Dave, and thank you again, everybody else, for joining us. We hope you all have a great night.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a good holiday season.